This morning, it's a great pleasure to introduce Tarik Cyril Amar, probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but hopefully pretty accurately. Okay, thank you. Tarik is currently a professor of history at Koç University in Istanbul. Formerly, he was an associate professor of history at both Columbia and the Harriman Institute. His specialty is Ukraine and Russia's near abroad, about which he has written extensively. His book, The Paradox of Ukrainian Lviv, a borderland city between Nazis, Stalinists, and nationalists, analyzes the conflicting forces that have transformed an important multi-ethnic borderline city in western Ukraine. As well, Tarik has written widely on the Holocaust and was associated with the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. He has a PhD in history from Princeton, and if there's any doubt that his love is history, he has degrees in history as well from Oxford and the London School of Economics. And while today's talk will be in English, it's very comforting to know that just in case, Tarik is also fluent in German, French, Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish. So, Tarik, thanks so much for joining us today, and the platform is all yours.
Thank you very much for the very kind invitation and introduction as well. I should really start by thanking the organizers in general and the Chappaqua Library for inviting me to this talk. I have prepared a talk that I think will, I'm quite sure, will take about 45 minutes. And then, of course, I'm very much looking forward to your questions in the Q&A or comments or criticism as well. I should say one thing before I start, partly because this is Zoom and I can't really see my audience. I'd be very grateful if you gave me a signal in case the sound is not good enough or I start speaking too fast or any such other thing occurs. Just let me know and then I'll make the requisite adjustments as it were. So, and I was very kindly invited to give this talk. The topic about which I was asked to speak was what should be US foreign policy toward Ukraine? And if I'm not mistaken, my talk has been announced as addressing significant developments in Ukraine. Those are both extremely good questions, and they're also linked to each other, obviously, and they're timely. And moreover, they're clearly important for Ukraine and I think beyond Ukraine as well. However, by preparing this talk, I've come to feel that the best way to approach it would be to slightly revise the topic by actually adopting a slightly wider lens. So what I would like to do today is make a semi-systematic, as it were, attempt to consider what has recently happened in and to and about Ukraine from a particular angle, namely with reference to the question of how we, speaking deliberately, very generally here, got from the end of the Cold War 3 decades ago, a time largely characterized, I think, by hope, to the discouraging international situation that we are facing now. I feel that it is symptomatic of this distressing post-Cold War turn of events that, as you probably know, there is currently a debate among experts and pundits about the question whether we are in a new Cold War or not. Without trying to add my own answer, which would be unoriginal, to that debate, I feel that what's really, I would even say genuinely world historically remarkable about this discussion is the simple fact that we are having it. In other words, we haven't even had time to let the Cold War recede into history or even learn much from it. And here we are already, historically speaking, in a blink of an eye, heavy to talk about the question of whether the Cold War is back. To ask why this has happened means, of course, to raise a big question that could be tackled in different ways. But I think that the Ukrainian crisis, which began in the winter of 2013-14 and has not yet ended, is a good vantage point from which to look at this larger issue of how the chance of a fresh and presumably better beginning after the end of the Cold War has been largely squandered. I should add here that I realize that this approach to my topic means that some other and important issues will receive little or no attention in it. For instance, I will not say much about the current state of the presidential elections in Ukraine, but I would like to emphasize that, of course, you should please not hesitate to bring up in the Q&A anything I have to omit or neglect in my talk. Now, before I get to the central question that I've just outlined, I should clarify 4 points. First of all, I use the term Ukraine crisis as a shorthand. Of course, what we are really talking about is a combination of revolution, geopolitical reorientation, regional internal unrest, and invasion, in which multiple countries or international and supranational organizations have played important roles, including, apart from Ukraine, of course, Russia, the EU and its member states, the USA, and the international institutions such as the IMF and the OSCE. The Ukraine crisis does have genuine domestic aspects rooted in Ukraine's internal development, but this Ukraine crisis would not have come into existence or taken the shape it has or lasted so long without its international participants. They, and not only Russia, are at least equally important. Secondly, when I said just a moment ago that the end of the Cold War was a moment of hope and opportunity, there was one thing I certainly did not want to imply, namely that we got out of the Cold War without plenty of reasons for regrets and actually humility. The Cold War may or may not have been inevitable, but it was certainly nothing that anybody should be remotely proud of on any side. On the contrary, I think it's fair to describe it as an era of great hubris, of great lying, and of great violence. And again, by no means on one side only. In other words, if we adopt a global perspective, and that is actually the only one that is intellectually and ethically adequate here, I feel, then we quickly see that the Cold War was not a long peace. Instead, it was a bloody and destructive half-truce. Indeed, millions of lives, literally millions, were lost and spoiled in proxy wars and ideologically motivated repression and mass killings in places such as Vietnam, Afghanistan, or Indonesia, to name only very few. And that was only part of all the damage the Cold War did or made worse. Yet when it ended with a negotiated, if uneven settlement instead of a Big Bang, at least humanity was still there. Even on the whole, I would say thriving. And it had managed to avoid bombing itself back into an irradiated Stone Age, which was a real possibility. My third preliminary point is about ways of speaking. Especially the initial phase of the Ukraine crisis produced not only a war of arms, but also a war of words. And here I do not mean what is often referred to as information war now, namely the deliberate spreading of lies via mass media and especially social media. Instead, I'm referring to bitter, if at least partially sincere fights, usually among intellectuals, over how to talk about the crisis. Thus, for instance, it has been a challenge to capture the real, if limited, domestic aspects of the fighting in parts of eastern Ukraine. Because for some observers, usually sympathetic to Kiev, any mention of the term civil war, if ever so circumscribed, smacks of Russian propaganda. And try to tell some Russian interlocutors that what happened to Crimea in 2014 was an annexation by conquest, which is, of course, simply the correct term. In addition, against the general backdrop of the deterioration in the relationship between the West and Russia, even the tone of discussion has sometimes been subjected to unproductive scrutiny. In particular, dispassionate attempts to think about how Russia sees the world can be misunderstood as taking its side, whether deliberately or merely in the role of a so-called useful idiot. That's why I'd like to say from the outset that my talk will be very thin on denunciation. Yes, in Ukraine, Russia is the aggressor, and in breach of international law in general, as well as several specific agreements. And yes, there are other things to criticize Russia for as well. But that's so clear that it need not be endlessly reiterated or underlined by strident language. What I think we should focus on more is analysis. And my fourth and last preliminary point, as a matter of full disclosure, I should say that I have something of a special relationship to Ukraine. I've lived there for altogether 5 years, and I know both Ukrainian and Russian, which are similar languages, but by no means the same or simply mutually understandable. I stress this because Ukraine is a de facto bilingual country. The situation between Russian and Ukrainian is not symmetrical, but nevertheless, Ukraine functions really as a bilingual country. Whatever you may hear from, I think, misguided activists or misleading politicians trying to repress or exploit that bilingualism. If you want to regularly follow major Ukrainian television talk shows, for instance, you will need to know both languages because you will find that often both are used in one and the same show, sometimes actually by the same speakers. Indeed, this de facto pragmatism at odds with doctrinaire nationalism of any shade is one of Ukraine's great strengths. I've also taken Ukraine's aspirations for independence and better government very seriously for a long time. Thus, when Ukraine's Orange Revolution, another earlier Maidan revolution, happened in the winter of 2004-2005, I traveled to the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, with friends from the city of Lviv in Western Ukraine. While also working with a German journalist, I made no pretense of neutrality, but wore an orange armband to show my support for the anti-government protesters. While the outcome of that revolution turned into general disappointment rapidly, a little bit like what has happened after the Euromaidan of 2013-14 actually, I don't regret taking that position then. And later I worked in Lviv as the director of an institute that was researching urban history and engaged in various civic projects as well. In 2010, the city honored me with a decoration for that work. And sadly, I recently had to return that decoration because Lviv was going not only too far, that's an old problem, but I felt really far too far in promoting and permitting the public veneration of Ukrainian far-right ethno-nationalists of World War II. That is men, mostly men, who participated in the Holocaust and conducted deliberate and ferocious ethnic cleansing campaigns against Poles as well. I'm mentioning this personal side of my relationship to Ukraine, not only as a matter of transparency, but also because my talk today puts Ukraine in an international context. Moreover, it accords special attention to Russia. This is not a sign of neglect of or disrespect for Ukraine, the self-determination of its people, or its sovereignty. It is simply the inevitable outcome of the fact that the crisis from which Ukraine currently suffers is, as I mentioned above, inexplicable and also, I believe, unsolvable without close attention to its international context. So now in this spirit, I would like to address three main questions. Simply enumerated, they may look a little arbitrary, but I hope that you will see how they connect once we talk about them in more detail. The first one is, when and how did the Cold War end? And what has happened to Ukraine since then? The second one is, what does Russia want? And why does Russia want what it wants? And the third one is, what is to be done? And equally important, what should we not do? Now, about the first question, when and how did the Cold War end? And what has happened to Ukraine since then? In this regard, considering the end of the Cold War, there are really only two key points that we need to emphasize here, I fear. The Cold War did not end in 1991. Or put differently, the Cold War did not end when and because the Soviet Union ended. That widespread idea is, I think this needs to be put clearly, flat wrong and badly misleading, no matter how often it is repeated. Instead, the Cold War ended in the late 1980s, when the Soviet Union had problems, but its end was by no means a foregone conclusion or mostly expected. What happened immediately after the Cold War ended, namely the dissolution of the Soviet sphere of domination in Eastern Europe, which then facilitated the fall of the East German communist regime and the unification of Germany, these events were made possible by the fact that the Cold War was already over. Then, by the end of 1991, when the Soviet Union was abolished by an agreement between leaders of several of its key republics, including and foremost, of course, Russia, under Boris Yeltsin, the Cold War had been over for at least 2 years. Another republic that, apart from Russia, played an important role in the self-dissolution of the Soviet Union was, of course, Ukraine. Ukraine's Soviet leaders at the time made the transition from leading a junior but very important part of the Soviet Union to leading a sovereign country, not as a consequence of a national revolution or because of a sudden discovery of their long-lost national consciences. There had been important protests in Ukraine, some along class and some along national lines. The Ukrainian leadership did seek an accommodation with a substantial, nationally oriented opposition movement. But, and this is a crucial point that has shaped the subsequent history of independent Ukraine, this was a mixture of compromise and adapting to what happened. It was not a revolution. Thus, post-Soviet Ukraine began its existence as an independent state, not with a rupture in its ruling elites or really in its institutions, but with much continuity. This fact had two main implications that bear emphasis here. First, the transition to independence was peaceful. Secondly, it was shot through with unresolved issues. Ukraine emerged as an independent state, but its geopolitical orientation, its economic structure, and its political system were all unsettled questions. Since then, several major developments have taken place that we need to note here, I think. First, like in Russia, though with some differences in detail, a class of oligarchs arose. And while there have been some changes, in general, the economic and political power has never been broken, up until now, including the last revolution. Second, not unrelated, corruption became an essential, if detrimental, feature of Ukraine. Hardly less than in Russia, unfortunately. Here as well, there have been some changes, especially recently, but certainly no breakthrough. Indeed, very recently, we have seen a major setback again. At the same time, we know from reliable and repeated polling evidence that voters' anger regarding corruption has become one of the most powerful and persistent factors in Ukrainian politics. This means that either persuasively promising an end to corruption or disappointing those hopes can make or break a political career, as we can, I think, observe right now in the ongoing Ukrainian presidential elections. The third point is that Ukrainian politics, unlike Russian politics, has not taken a persistent turn to authoritarianism. The leader who tried to impose such a development, was Viktor Yanukovych. the president who was toppled in 2014. His sudden attempt to align Ukraine with an emerging Russian-led economic and political sphere, instead of with the European Union, was the trigger for the uprising that brought him down, often called, as you know, the Euromaidan, or also the Revolution of Dignity. But the underlying issue was twofold: his ostentatious escalation of corruption and self-enrichment, even beyond what was ordinary in Ukraine, and his attempt to lock Ukraine into an authoritarian political system. Since 2014, after Yanukovych's fall, Ukraine's politics have reverted largely to what they were already between 2005 and 2010, a flawed but substantially democratic system with elections that are principally unpredictable and make a difference, and a public sphere that matters as well. Now, fourth point, geopolitically, Ukraine has now, after this last revolution, undergone a great and unprecedented shift from, in essence, a policy of opportunistic balancing between Russia and the West to a policy of clear alignment with, and of course, dependence on the West. That is here mainly the European Union and the USA. In the long term, this shift may or may not be reversible as a whole or in part. What is certain, however, I think, is that Russia's aggression against Ukraine, that is in essence the annexation of Crimea and the indirect and direct support of rebels and separatists in parts of eastern Ukraine, make it more, not less likely, that Ukraine's westward shift will last. Put differently, Russia may have succeeded in securing the strategically important location of Crimea and in de facto obstructing any NATO prospects for Ukraine. But it has done so at the price not only of sanctions and partial international isolation, but of solidifying Ukraine's resistance and its turn to the West as well. Moreover, while Ukrainians sometimes complain, mistakenly I think, about insufficient Western support, in reality, the West has never before invested in Ukraine as it does now, politically and financially. With much of this support actually due to the West's decision to counter Russia's pressure, that Russian pressure has ironically not only severely damaged Ukraine, but also in effect triggered Western support for it. As a fifth point, the single most worrying development in Ukraine's politics domestically is something that has been largely neglected, and I suspect even actively downplayed in Western media, and that is the rise of an aggressive and I think dangerous far right that has succeeded, unfortunately, in embedding itself in parts of the military and police, the state in general, business, and actually crime as well. Unfortunately, it's not long ago that almost any mention of this fact was routinely derided as Russian propaganda, or at least a form of disloyalty to the common cause of Ukraine and the West in resisting Russia. This, let me be clear here again, has probably been the single worst mistake made by some Western observers of Ukraine, including journalists and public intellectuals. It was also a mistake that could easily have been avoided. Now, there's no time here to go into details on the far right in Ukraine, but let me point out 5 important aspects. One, the fact that the Ukrainian far right does not have much electoral success, does not mean it is powerless or not dangerous. Second, the far right has an inherent interest in instability. Its best chance in Ukrainian politics consists in bringing these politics back into the streets again. That is one reason why another Maidan-style revolution would be a very risky idea. The third point is the Ukrainian far right is media savvy. It has learned to present gullible Westerners with a Potemkin village-style facade, if I may use a Russian term here, or Russian-inspired term, of mere patriotic activism For instance, to fight corruption or replace or supplement an often unreliable police force in maintaining public order. Fourth, the Ukrainian far right is connected internationally. And fifth, last but not least, the Ukrainian far right is violent, not only on the battlefields in eastern Ukraine, but also against minorities, political opponents, and especially the left throughout the country. There is moreover a deeply disturbing pattern of tolerance and impunity of such far-right violence that of course enhances its powers of persuasion and intimidation. Now, the second big point, what does Russia want and why does it want what it wants? How has Russia factored into the story that I have sketched above? And how can the way in which Russia has factored into it speak to the larger question of how we all, I believe, squandered the opportunities of the end of the Cold War, the question with which I began this talk? The most simple and very popular answer, I think, is, of course, that Russia is to blame for both the general deterioration of post-Cold War relations in general and for, up until now at least, the single most resonant international outcome of that deterioration, which is the Ukraine crisis in particular. Within the framework of this simple answer, we find some variation, different flavors, so to speak. And the two most prominent are, it's really Russia that's to blame, and it's not so much Russia as Russia, but Putin personally, its leader, of course. Like some other observers, I would like to offer an alternative to these answers. And to begin with, let me remove some obstacles to what I think would be a better, a more realistic approach. Here are three things that I believe Russia does really not want. Russia does not want to rebuild the Soviet Union, or for that matter, the Tsarist Empire, as it was before World War I and the revolution. Russia does not want to globally destroy democracy or spread its own specific brand of authoritarian capitalist oligarchic politics everywhere, or destroy the basis of the international order as such. And third, Russia does not simply want what Putin wants. And even less, for that matter, does Russia want what some cranky philosopher, say Alexander Dugin, the Eurasianist, in a think tank may want. Those three ideas are quite popular, but I believe that they are superficial, unfortunately sensationalist, and really unhelpful. While they work with some facts, they embed them in a pre-existing desire to blame Russia, and Russia alone, not only for international tensions, but also for almost everything by now that frustrates us in our own politics here at home in the West. From the perfect catastrophe of Donald Trump in the United States, via the grotesque spectacle of Brexit in Great Britain, to the rise of the far right in Europe. For all of these things, Russia has been blamed repeatedly, and I think on the whole unrealistically. Blaming it all on Russia and or Putin, this explanation cum indictment seems to make even more sense if we take into account not only Ukraine, but also Georgia or Moldova, or since 2015, the Russian intervention in Syria. And on top of all that, we can add the virtual world of cyberspace and various Russian initiatives in the global south. Moreover, words and wars aren't all there is. There are also assassinations, some of them spectacular and actually spectacularly botched as well. So in a selection of Putin's repeatedly confrontational statements, and they're quite genuine, of course, and the main culprit himself provides rich evidence of his dangerous mind. There were, for instance, his conspiracy theory type references to outside, that is Western forces, out to subvert and destroy Russia after bloody hostage drama as far back as 2004. His harsh, though not actually entirely baseless, attacks on the USA and its overreach in 2007, or his appeal to ethnic Russian nationalism in the spring of 2014 just after the annexation of Crimea. And while some Western observers who should really know better have advanced the hysterical comparison between Putin and Hitler, let's not forget that Putin himself has, of course, been no slouch in making absurd Nazi and Hitler references with respect to his opponents too, and not only in or since the Ukraine crisis. It seems in some easy to connect the dots and find a pattern of Russian assertiveness and aggression. And from there, it's a small, but I would argue mistaken step to explaining this pattern in ways that reassuringly leave the West with nothing to regret and, much more importantly, nothing to change in its own approach. There is, of course, a real link between the Ukraine crisis and the manner in which Russia's image has taken a nosedive. As mentioned before, Russia has been the aggressor in Ukraine. Its troops and forces supported by it, and at least to a substantial part dependent on it and under its influence, have fought and killed to attack a country that had frustrated Russian leaders, especially in their priority project of building a Eurasian politico-economic sphere, or in Russian parlance, pole, to compete but also cooperate with other regional associations in an emerging multipolar world. But Ukraine had certainly not attacked Russia. Russia has conquered Crimea militarily and then annexed it. This particular campaign was largely bloodless, but only because at that point in the spring of 2014, the Ukrainian government took the right decision, I think, not to fight these Russian invaders and not to fight them there. The Russian conquest of the peninsula was accompanied by a deeply flawed pseudo-referendum, really a spectacle rather than a substantial probing of the population's political preference, whatever that may have been. With respect to Crimea, let me add a few observations. My sense is that in considering the annexation of Crimea, we need to make a distinction because there are two different questions involved, at least. One is whether we can see any features of Crimea that Russia could use to argue for some sort of special concern with this particular territory. The other question is if anything at all could justify the manner in which Russia has chosen to handle this concern, namely by clearly illegal force. The answer to question number one is a cautious and circumscribed yes, I think. Yes, there are security and historical considerations that are not absurd or mere propaganda, and that Russia could cite in what counts in politics for good faith in order to argue for a special concern with Crimea. But the answer to the second question is the one that, especially now after the annexation, really matters. And I think it is a flat no. There is no way in which Russia could possibly justify its decision to pursue this interest in Crimea by violence and annexation. In sum, that Russia had substantial concerns over Crimea is something that a reasonable observer could intellectually understand, and in my view, should have taken seriously too. But that Russia took Crimea without consent of Ukraine and by subterfuge and force cannot be justified. And that is thanks to Russian top leadership decisions where we are now, alas. There's one last point that I think we should pay attention to regarding the meaning of what has happened in Crimea. When Russia snatched this territory, there were prominent concerns in the West that this operation constituted a frightening precedent in two respects. First, in principle, as undermining the international order in general by demonstrative application of a might makes right logic. Second, more specifically, as foreshadowing a wave of Russian aggression under the pretexts of protecting ethnic Russians and even Russian speakers, and of inadmissible historical claims. And for a moment, but by no means forever, Putin himself did his best, or rather his worst, to confirm such Western concerns by signaling an ethno-nationalist turn in Russian policy and unleashing irresponsible notions such as New Russia, Novorossiya, a toxic term if used outside a history book, implying that much of Ukraine should be Russian now. Yet the key point we should note here is that these specific Western concerns have not been confirmed by the reality of Russian actions since 2014. This is very important, I think. New Russia was dropped quickly. There was no second or third, if we count Crimea, major invasion of Ukraine, as confidently predicted by quite a few Western experts. And while Crimea has remained annexed, the rebel areas in eastern Ukraine have not followed it into that status. There has been no crisis over Russians in Kazakhstan, no attack on the Baltic states, especially Estonia or Latvia, and no escalation of meddling in Moldova, the Transnistria issue that is long-standing. All of these things have not happened. And all of these are potential flashpoints that were warned about by at least some, and sometimes many, Western commentators back in 2014, 2015. I think it's a matter of intellectual honesty and realism to also realize when our fears have not come true. We could, of course, interpret this outcome as due only to Western counter-pressure against Russia. I personally think that the West's strong response over Ukraine, which I believe surprised the Russian leadership, has made some contribution to Russia not escalating even further. So has the related or unrelated intermittent collapse in the price of oil, of course. On the other hand, we should also ask whether Crimea may really have been special in the thinking of the Russian leadership. And this is by no means a justification. I think that it was, and that it was a Western mistake, helped along by Russian rhetoric and propaganda, to generalize from what Russia did in Crimea to what it would do anywhere else. This, I feel, is an important point to note looking forward. Sooner rather than later, I feel, Ukraine and the West may well have to come to an open-ended and pragmatic modus vivendi about the Crimea annexation by not recognizing it, but also de facto by accepting it for the time being. In this respect, the question of how much a precedent or a sui generis case this part of the Ukraine crisis has really been will be important. So in sum, if there is a pattern of Russian assertiveness and aggression, then it's far less reliable than grand theories, really just guesses, I would say, about external expansionism, the Russian soul and its insecurities, neo-Soviet nostalgia, or Putin's personal preoccupations can ever explain. These generalizations just don't work once we take an even slightly closer look at reality. The question that arises then is, how does post-Soviet Russia actually tick? Let me sketch my own answer, which is neither entirely original nor obviously error-proof, but which I would insist is more realistic and useful than what I have just called the grand theories. In essence, I think we are seeing the interaction of three main factors. First, Russia's elite and substantial parts of its population, while often critical of their rulers, do share the conviction that the post-Cold War order is principally flawed in Russia's disfavor. This perception is crucial. There are two causes of its resonance. One is that societies, like individuals, that face failures for which they should seek the reasons with themselves, tend to look for scapegoats abroad or outside or with others. Russiagate, or as I call it, Russia rage, has been an example of this phenomenon in the United States just now. Likewise, in Russia, a host of frustrations are blamed on the West, and especially on the US. From the Soviet collapse itself, via the chaotic, poor, and socially deeply unfair 1990s, to the overall loss of national status that the country has suffered. And what makes these accusations, and I would argue projections, so powerful is the fact that as with Russiagate, Russia Rage, they are fundamentally mistaken, but they also contain fragments of reality, exaggerated and distorted fragments for sure, but nonetheless of reality. And this is where we touch again on what really went wrong since the end of the Cold War, and in particular, the West's contribution to it. The West has not only expanded its influence, but it has also done so in a principally, sometimes almost gleefully unilateral manner. When Victoria Nuland, for instance, is credibly reported to have gloated over making, quote, the Russians eat their spinach, or when Barack Obama publicly dismissed Russia as a mere regional power, I, for one, remain simply stunned by the thoughtlessness, by the unnecessary unprofessionalism such statements betray. And they have not only occurred in the United States, but of course in Europe as well on occasion. Less anecdotally, the West has used its real preponderance of power after the end of the Cold War to again and again confront Russia with a simple choice. Yes, we talk to you, but the outcome is agree to what we do, or we'll do it anyhow, but without your agreement. This was true over NATO enlargement, the Yugoslav Wars of Succession, Iraq, Kosovo, the ABM Treaty, and Libya. Last but not least, it was actually true for the manner in which the European Union competed over Ukraine's allegiance with Russia's Eurasian project. Now, don't get me wrong, please. My point here is not whether the West should or should have done or should not have done any of these things. That's not my question. That is a different and probably now futile question, actually. My point is that if we want to find better ways forward out of the current crisis, then we must be realistic not only about Russia, but also about our own past behavior, because that is the only way we can distinguish between Russian concerns that we cannot possibly accept and concerns that we should actually take into account. Put differently, if we insist that we, our side, the West, has made no mistakes at all, then it would follow that we also can change nothing, which of course then would leave us with only one option, namely increasing the pressure. The second major point that we should consider here is that Russia, while, despite the hype in East and West, much weaker than the West, or even the USA taken on its own, in almost every metric you can imagine: wealth, military, economics, technology, demography, alliances, you name it, Russia is weaker. Nevertheless, it has also been recovering from its low point in the 1990s very clearly. This recovery has been uneven and flawed. For instance, Russia has failed to reduce its fundamental dependency on natural resources. It has failed to diversify its economy enough, and it has failed to shift to knowledge and innovation, as at least some Russian leaders know it must. But the key point remains: Russia has somehow managed to accumulate enough power again to try to reassert itself, regionally and even to some extent globally. Thus, the Georgian War in 2008, for instance, was not only a signal that Russia was ready to use force to limit further NATO expansion, an expansion that I personally think should never have been promised to either Georgia or Ukraine. That war was also followed by a major and in post-Soviet times unprecedented push for military modernization. This initiative, still ongoing, has moreover shown real, if in the area again of innovation, mixed results, some of which were actually on display in Crimea. More importantly, while the combination of sanctions and the oil price slump caused cuts even in this area, it has largely been successfully insulated from this economic fallout. In other words, while Russia has unresolved long-term problems, its short and medium-term recovery as an international power is real and unlikely to end soon. The third key factor we need to consider is that I feel in the long term, Russia's future is uncertain. And it does not take the skeptical and cynical mindset of Vladimir Putin to worry about Russia's outlook. Consider, in addition to the issues already mentioned, that the Ukraine crisis has also signaled the crippling, or at least substantial downscaling, of Russia's plans for a Eurasian economic and political sphere. The Eurasian Economic Union has, of course, come into existence, even without Ukraine, but it is much less than Russia expected. Moreover, the fact of the Ukraine crisis and Russia's violent overreaction itself has undermined this project. What Russia wanted out of a regional sphere of its own was an entity that could compete, but also cooperate with the EU. Ideally, it was supposed to function as, this is a quote from one of the major Russian leaders, I think it's Putin, but I might be wrong here, a bridge between Europe and the Asia-Pacific region, with Russia gaining, of course, from being the most important element of that bridge. More generally speaking, the Russian plan for the Eurasian Economic Union was to make it, in Putin's words, one of the major, quote, poles of the modern world. It was, put differently, meant to converge with globalization, not be in tension with it. The Ukraine crisis has at least severely undermined all of these ambitions. The second example of Russia's long-term uncertainties is the relationship with China. Once again, permit me a summary statement here. The gist of that relationship is definitely not the forming of a powerful and harmonious Sino-Russian bloc, in which Russia would be an equal. Rather, what we see is a cautious and pragmatic approach on both sides in the larger context of China's superiority. The superiority that has its roots, in essence, in one single decisive historical fact, namely that communist China after 1978 did what the Soviet Union failed to do, reform and preserve the system. And this superiority of China as towards Russia is likely to grow. Now, I'd like to make some concluding remarks under the heading of my third question, what is to be done and what should we not do? And I would like to do that by raising a question, actually, that takes a few introductory remarks of its own. Please bear with me and recall once more that the Cold War did not end in 1991. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, in reality, it ended, as we said, in the late 80s with a negotiated, and it bears emphasis, unlikely, really unlikely settlement. The first precondition of the settlement was an unexpected and counterintuitive Soviet initiative. Without a revolution, or at this point, a catastrophic crisis, such as a major, vitally threatening defeat in war, the seemingly stagnant Soviet system itself had produced a leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was both a shrewd careerist and politician and a superbly, even foolishly self-confident idealist. He believed that the tired and grim Soviet Union, with all its historic baggage, could still be reformed into a sort of super Sweden, a social democratic utopia. He also thought that the Cold War could be ended and Soviet military power reduced without endangering Soviet security. On the other side, you had, of course, Ronald Reagan, an arch-conservative, to put it mildly, and fervent anti-communist and Cold Warrior. His equally superbly self-confident belief in himself and his own intuition, however, made it possible for him to indulge in his own utopianism, later snidely dismissed by George Bush Sr. as that vision thing. And that in turn allowed Reagan to take Gorbachev by his word and agree to end the Cold War on conditions that were favorable to the USA, definitely, but without claiming victory. Misplaced howls of triumph came only later. Perhaps most infamously, I would say, in George Bush I's State of the Union address of 1992, when he, quite blasphemously too, I would say, insisted that by the grace of God, the Cold War had not merely ended, but been won by the USA. In sum, the Cold War ended and ended without a big bang, because at that point, the decline of the Soviet Union was managed unsentimentally. Advantage was taken, but also cautiously, and I'm even tempted to say wisely. That wisdom soon ran out, but for a moment, a decisive moment, it somehow prevailed. What could this mean for how to approach the current tension between Russia and the West? As I have sketched above, I think that our most efficient way to think about Russia at this point requires taking several main points into account. First, regarding Russia's sense that the post-Cold War international order failed to offer it a fair place. That sense is genuine. It is not just propaganda, but a largely sincere conviction. Of course, in principle, convictions can be genuine, but still entirely misguided. But that is not the case here either. Despite Russia's substantial contributions to its own isolation, the West has made mistakes as well. The point here is not to assign blame or to politely redistribute and share it, as it were. The point is that the West has some rethinking to do as well. Secondly, this Russian sense of grievance is not the invention of Vladimir Putin. He also doesn't entirely or ultimately control it. He can manipulate it and he can work with it, sometimes deftly, sometimes not. But the point that really matters is that it's set in before Putin. You can find quotes of Yeltsin that are very, very much like Putin speaking today. They've just been forgotten. And while nobody can predict the future, we would be foolish to assume that this resentment will vanish when Putin won't be in charge anymore. Let me be more specific here. When Putin will no longer be in power, we may face either a more liberal and democratic Russia, or a more authoritarian one, or just more of the status quo as it is now. And it would be a mistake to assume that a more liberal and democratic Russia, if that happens, would necessarily make international relations any easier. Moreover, talk therapy, or listening more to each other, will not suffice in principle, because the current tensions are not due to misunderstandings. They have real causes and will require real changes. So what can the West do and what should it not do? First of all, it should stop, in my view, and my Ukrainian friends really don't like hearing this, it should stop expanding NATO. NATO should not play Starfleet with a mission to go everywhere and spread liberal values, free markets, and our idea of democracy. It should be a mutual security club where each new member has to not only need protection, but also be able to help protect all others. I do not see this balance working out for either Georgia or Ukraine. Moreover, both countries are actually, I'm convinced, better off outside than inside NATO. Here are a few further don'ts. Do not over-focus on Putin. He may be a problem for the West, but he's not the root problem of the current crisis, broadly understood. Do not believe in stories that invoke things such as eternal Russian drives, genetically set predispositions, or comparisons with Hitler. Do not bet on democratization in Russia. It would be a very good thing, but for the West, it would be foolish as well as genuinely provocative to make that our main hope. Regime change, by whatever means, is not the solution, even less in this case than elsewhere. Moreover, right now, and I say this without a trace of sarcasm, the USA is not in a good place to promote democracy anywhere. Finally, do not make a full and fully satisfying solution to the Ukraine crisis the precondition for addressing the larger issue of how to escape from the post-Cold War deterioration in general. And my final point, if the Cold War ended because the West was ready to find a negotiated settlement with the Soviet Union that was clearly weaker and weakening further, then the lesson for our day may be that we need to find a new modus vivendi with Russia that fulfills three key conditions. It has to, of course, preserve our interests. It has to take into account Russia's relative reassertion. And it has to also take into account its challenges of potential long-term decline. Thank you very much.
Tarik, thank you so much. That was very comprehensive, to say the least. You covered virtually every aspect of the elements that you raised beautifully, I think. Let me ask the first question. The situation on the ground now in East Ukraine and Crimea. Now, we know, obviously, in East Ukraine, we're in a stalemate, basically. It looks like there will be not much change there. But what's going on with the people on the ground? In other words, the local population, do they, in fact, fully accept the Republic of Luhansk and Republic of Donetsk, or are they perhaps beginning to wonder whether the Russian incursion and the dominance of their current economy is something they can happily live with? And let us look at Crimea in the same vein. In other words, what is the feeling of the local populace about the change in the situation after 2014?
Yeah. So maybe let's start with Crimea. The one restriction that we have to live with in this respect is the fact that it is, of course, now very difficult to gauge popular opinion in Crimea or in the eastern rebel or separatist areas. We have very good polling for all of Ukraine that is not part of these areas. We have polling among displaced, internally displaced persons. We have polling close to these areas, but none of this obviously replaces the ability to actually go and systematically and representatively ask people there. So having said that, the case in Crimea is different because Crimea is a territory that, as you probably know, actually literally did have a special status in Ukraine. It was not an oblast like other Ukrainian regions. Ukraine is a so-called unitary state. Crimea had a special status, an autonomous status, in fact, inside Ukraine. And inside Crimea, the city of Sevastopol, the most important city in Crimea, had a special status again. But that's not so important now. Moreover, if you think in terms of the ethnic composition of the population, then Crimea is, ethnically speaking, the one part of Ukraine where ethnic Russians actually constituted a majority. It's the only part where that's actually true, or the only large part. So if you ask how do people respond to the developments since 2014, you have to, I think, distinguish between this. I guess that you must distinguish between this Russian ethnic majority in this particular case, and on the other side, the other larger groups, namely Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, around 20%. These are contested figures. You will find slightly different ones as well. And of course, Crimean Tatars, around 10 or 11%. Now, if you look at the Tatars as a community, they have suffered some severe repression. And you find the traces of that in reports by Amnesty International or by Human Rights Watch, for instance. And just recently, there has been another arrest wave. Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians in Crimea, as far as they have not left or adapted, as far as they have been politically active against the Russian takeover, have also suffered repression. Inside these two groups, I think it's fair to assume that you would find a lot of people who do not accept the annexation and Russian rule. The larger group of ethnic Russians, I think, is much more complicated to assess. And it is, I believe, quite possible that many of them actually acquiesce with this annexation, and that a sizable part of them supports it really actively. Let me stress that this doesn't make it right. The way in which this annexation came about and the way in which the so-called referendum was organized deprives it of justifiability, as it were. even if a majority of the population should actually by now agree with it. Now, if you look at the Eastern Territories, there is a little bit of research into how people have reacted to their lives under these two so-called republics. And what it seems to show us is that there must be a lot of discontent because the development of these two republics is generally much less positive than that of Ukraine, and there are a lot of problems in Ukraine. But the question is, how does the discontent cut? I'm sure that some of this discontent is directed against Russia, but it may take two major forms. One may be, we don't want Russia to exert any influence here. We want the Russians to go home. And the other one may be, we are actually disappointed because we wanted to be annexed. That is also, unfortunately, an option. Then you will also find, I'm sure, severe discontent with Kiev, unfortunately, because the way in which Kiev has handled its attempt to reconquer its territories, and let me again be very clear, it had every right to do so, but I still think the way in which they tried was wrong, fundamentally mistaken. They first stigmatized the rebellion as a terrorist operation by calling their own reconquest attempt an anti-terrorist operation, an ATO. This term has been dropped by now for good reasons, I think. Then the Ukrainian side, unfortunately, has also engaged in human rights abuses and some war crimes, it seems. And again, you find traces of that in Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And moreover, it has added gratuitous cruelties, such as, for instance, the treatment of pensioners, who are an extremely, even more in Ukraine than perhaps in some Western, more affluent societies. Pensioners are usually an incredibly exposed part of the population that can be very easily hurt. And Kiev's decision to stop paying pensions in these territories, unless very onerous and complicated conditions are fulfilled, was, I think, a major mistake. Let me add one thing. It's not an accident that one of the things that Poroshenko's opponent in the current election campaign for the presidency in Ukraine has now promised is to reverse that policy, to actually start paying the pensions normally, even in the occupied or rebel or separatist held territories. So that's what I could say about this.
Okay, thank you. Do we have some questions from the audience? Yeah, Harry?
Two of President Trump's closest advisors during his campaign period were closely related to Russian ethnic interests in the Ukraine, Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort. What impacts did that have on either Trump's campaign or his policies? And is there still any linkage there at all?
Yes. Okay. It is really. I had a very peculiar perspective on the emergence of Paul Manafort as Trump's campaign manager when he was doing that, and the reason for that was that I had heard of Paul Manafort much earlier, but in Ukraine. The word Manafort was actually, the name Manafort was actually quite well known there, at least among people who had some interest in politics, precisely because he was known as a fixer who had been brought in the period 2005 to 2010 to help especially Yanukovych recover his political fortunes. I cannot tell you that would just be something I don't know enough about. I cannot tell you in much detail what exactly he was doing and how much influence precisely he had. I can tell you one thing, which is that Manafort's, from what I've read, Manafort's work in Ukraine seems to have had two main aims. One was, of course, to support his client, Yanukovych. But the other was to actually work with Yanukovych and the complex of oligarchs around him, basically based in the east and southeast of Ukraine, mostly the east in this case, toward a policy that was balancing de facto between the European Union and Russia. So there's one thing I think I can say with some confidence, is that Manafort's imprint in Ukraine was not simply pro-Russian. And that has to do with a larger, with a larger aspect of Ukraine's politics before it took its geopolitical Western turn recently, which is, there's often a perception, I think, among Western observers that Ukraine was simply pro-Russian, except under Yushchenko, the president who came out of the Orange Revolution. But it's really not that simple. Ukraine was actually engaged in a very opportunistic, or the Ukrainian elites, I should say, were engaged in an opportunistic policy of playing both sides. Ukrainian oligarchs did not want to be taken over by Russian oligarchs at all, and they didn't want to lose their own power base. And the same is true for those oligarchs or their representatives, like Yanukovych, who then went into politics. So keeping their own national fiefdom was always an object for them. They were not simply pro-Russian, but they cultivated the Russian side clearly much more after 2010, when Yanukovych was elected president, than the Western side. As you know, and as I mentioned very, very sort of in passing in my talk, the trigger for the Euromaidan revolution in 2013-14 was precisely that the Yanukovych government had given its population reasons to think that they were going to sign an association agreement with the European Union over Russian objections. And that then very suddenly, in November 2013, at the famous Vilnius summit, they changed course really abruptly and basically came home and said, no, that's over, we are going to go with Russia. And that was the trigger, not the cause, but the trigger of the Euromaidan revolution. But one thing that tells you is, by the way, at this point, the current still president, Petro Poroshenko, was actually on Yanukovych's team. And he was there because he was responsible in part for these negotiations with the European Union. So at that point, working with and for Yanukovych, nefarious as it certainly was not necessarily simply pro-Russian.
You made a distinction between Russia's short-term or near-term strength and its long-term weakness. Would you go a little further into the long-term weakness and what that means for our foreign policy and where we're going?
Yes. So Russia has, since Putin has led Russia, and he's really led Russia now since 2000. As you know, there has been a period in 2008 and 2012 where formally he wasn't at the top, not entirely at the top, but in reality, Putin has led Russia since 2000. Now, since that's been the case, he has been able to, not he, but Russia has been able to generate impressive rates of growth, but only until about 2008. And after that, the first iteration of Putinism as a sort of political economic system actually ran out of steam. And since then, Russian economic growth has flattened out. It flattened out long before the Ukraine crisis. I mention this here because we know that Ukraine crisis or no Ukraine crisis, whatever the degree of international tension, sanctions, isolation, and so on, we really know already from experience that the manner in which Putin treated economic policy in his first two terms worked for a while, but then stopped working for reasons that Russia cannot control. And these reasons have to do with the fact that Russia, as many observers have noted, has not made a successful transition to a high value-added economy based on innovation. this is very interesting because it was one of the perennial problems of the Soviet Union as well. And you can even trace it to the late Tsarist Empire. There is a historian of Lauren Graham of the history of technology and science in Russia and the Soviet Union. And he made that extremely important distinction. And I think it's spot on by saying that Russia hasn't got a problem with innovation. When you look at modern Russian history, you find plenty of advanced innovation. Russia has a problem, a perennial problem with invention. I'm wrong. Russia has no problem with invention. You will find a lot of inventors and you find inventions. But it has a problem with innovation. It has a problem with actually making the inventions pay off and integrating them into its economic process and fully exploiting them. That problem is still there. Under Medvedev, 2008, 2012, there was a lot of talk about building a Russian Silicon Valley, Skolkovo, and it was built, but it's not very successful, unfortunately, or not as successful as was expected. And there was in general a lot of talk of finally closing that gap, and that transition has still not occurred. That is one of the, I think, most fundamental problems Russia faces. It's entirely unlike China in this way. The other problem is demographics. In the 1990s and 2000s, there were sensationalist scenarios that predicted that Russia would essentially fall apart because of demographic decline. Those scenarios had to be corrected. It's not quite as dramatic, but Russia definitely has demographic problems, and they're not abating yet. Its population is shrinking. And moreover, Russia will have to find, how shall I put it? Russia will have to find a constructive policy if our projections are correct, and I think they are correct. Russia will have to find a constructive policy of managing the fact that in the next decades, the Muslim part of its population is going to grow, and the non-Muslim part of its population is going to continue to decline. This need obviously not necessarily be a problem, right? That would be a racist perspective if you thought that in itself is a problem. It might actually be some sort of opportunity. But I'm sure that it's going to be a challenge politically. In terms of its military power, one problem that Russia now has, and that is, I find it very hard to see its way out of that, is that yes, it's modernizing its military. It has caught up. Its military has, to a significant extent, become better again than it was even in 2008. But Russia's situation in terms of alliances is actually pretty dismal. Russia is not embedded in a strong alliance system. And while we in the West have, serious problems inside NATO, partly because of Donald Trump, of course, but only partly. He's not doing that alone either. The Russian situation in terms of alliances is much worse again.
Thank you. Any other questions?
You placed your discussion of the Ukraine in a larger context, having to do with the decline of the end of the Cold War, or if you will. Let's assume for the moment that the United States has a different president and possibly Russia has a different president. You have stated that that part of what's going on, the reaction of the Russian state, goes beyond what Putin thinks and reflects a kind of Russian nationalism that that is much more long-standing. If the West is going to negotiate a détente at some point in the future, will it mean trading Russian majority portions of neighboring countries like Crimea, possibly parts of eastern Ukraine, possibly parts of the Baltic states, in order to satisfy this kind of Russian nationalism?
that has existed before Putin and will exist after Putin.
Let me recapitulate very, very quickly what I hope I understand correctly your question is. If I'm right, your question is about whether it would be necessary to allow Russia to change borders among its neighbors.
Yes.
So as to satisfy Russian nationalism by reintegrating in this fashion people that Russia sees as ethnic Russians or maybe as Russian speakers or culturally Russian, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that's impossible, frankly. I think that would create chaos. How shall I put it? There is one thing about Russian nationalism, a distinction in practice that's very important. Putin has, in 2014, I think that was the peak, really. Putin has played with fire in an entirely irresponsible manner by quite suddenly, actually, this was quite new for him, playing up the ethno-nationalist card. And the ethno-nationalist card in Russia is actually distinct from something that you could call state nationalism. And this may sound like a very sort of scholastic and overfine distinction, but in reality it matters enormously, actually. And you can trace this distinction in political language sometimes very specifically, namely, when Putin started saying, when he wanted to talk about Russians, in his speech after the annexation of Crimea, as many observers noted with great anxiety, very understandably, he started talking about Russians by using the Russian term Ruski. And Ruski refers to somebody who is ethnically Russian, right? Whatever that means. But we know there is a difference between the idea of somebody who is a Russian citizen, right? And somebody who is a Russian by ethnicity, right? And of course, the concept of a Russian by ethnicity, as any ethnic national concept, is much more explosive, potentially, because that's the leverage for hardcore nationalists to come in and say, well, somebody may be a citizen of Estonia, but actually, ethnically, that person is Russian and therefore belongs to us. And from that, we want to draw some sort of, conclusion that is usually disruptive. So Putin starts in March 2014. Crimea has just been annexed. He gives this speech in which he uses this term again and again and again. That in itself was sensationally frightening. It was also very unusual, actually, which is something many people overlooked. Now, usually Putin is much more keen on using the term Rossiyski. And that is a term that refers to Russian as belonging to the Russian state. You can be, for instance, ethnically something entirely different, maybe you're part of the German minority or whatever, and still be counted as Rossiyski, but not as Ruski. This is a very different thing. There is a discourse among Russian nationalists, who of course really exist, and some of them have a more sort of radical Orthodox flavoring. Some of them believe in ideas of white racism. They actually have white supremacy ideas. Some of them have very traditionalist ideas about imposing or recreating the glory of the empire. So there are these different flavors of Russian nationalism. But what one needs to be careful about is that these people do not make policy. They actually really don't make policy. And I'm not trying to be nice on Russia here. It's just the fact that they don't call the shots. If they ever start really calling the shots, we will have problems to which our current situation, by comparison with which our current situation will appear still very, very comfortable. Now, these people have a discourse about Russia as a divided nation. That's the thing with them. These people have a notion, a concept, a terminology to say that actually Russians ended up in all of these different countries around us and we need them back. And one way of getting them back is, yes, change borders, de facto force, countries to cede territory, invade, whatever that means. The thing about what happened after Putin seemed to signal that he was suddenly on board with these guys in March 2014. The main thing that happened, luckily, is that he didn't follow through on that. That is very important. Putin did raise the ethno-nationalist flag for a moment, and he has himself to blame very much that people got extremely frightened. But he did not follow through on this project. It may be that, one day he or somebody else might appeal to this set of ideas and this group of people again. But at the moment, this is actually not Russian policy. And we also know that for a long time after the Soviet Union collapsed, in spite of all the rhetoric, the big story is that Russia hasn't done these things, right? That is a much bigger story in some ways than the very, very unfortunate exception when it suddenly, became much more aggressive. But again, some people thought that, as I mentioned in my talk, now that they have done this in Crimea, now that they're doing this in eastern Ukraine, the next one is going to be Estonia, Latvia, Transnistria, and Moldova. Then they're going to do something about the Russians in Kazakhstan. They're going to go after all of these Russian groups, right? And they're going to stir up trouble and possibly try to change borders again. Very, very fortunately, at this point, this has not happened, and it is not the policy. I think the West should never, never, never signal any readiness to give in to this sort of stuff. And that is why, among other things, the West, I don't think that the West can simply recognize Crimea as Russian. I think that would be a terrible thing to happen. It probably has to somehow find a de facto modus vivendi for a while. This has happened. Let me add one thing. I know I've talked for a very long time, but something similar has actually happened in history. The Baltic states were never recognized as parts of the Soviet Union by the United States. Nevertheless, throughout the whole Cold War, everybody agreed not to fight a war about them, which was a very good decision. So it is possible to get through decades, if necessary, with a situation which is inconsistent, which has not been fully resolved. And my sense is that Crimea is going in that direction.
Thank you. Other questions?
I have a completely different understanding of what you're describing. I think Russia has always wanted Crimea, Ukraine, and Latvia and Lithuania because of an access to the sea. And that was more their interest than all the ethnic part that you're talking about. The access to the sea, because they're mostly inland.
Concerning Crimea, I think the access to the Black Sea and to the ability to deny the Black Sea effectively to other powers, that was, I think, very important for the Crimean situation. Maybe technically there could have been other ways in which Russia could, in the long run, have resolved this issue. But in the short run, not. And when the crisis happened, Russia had a basing contract that was going to end in the 2040s. I can't give you the exact year anymore. I can't remember. It was 42, 2047, and had been signed with Yanukovych, the president who was toppled. And my sense is that one of the reasons, yes, one of the substantial reasons, the genuine reasons, not just talk, why Russia annexed Crimea, invaded and annexed Crimea, was this very hardcore geopolitical military reason, that it wanted to maintain what it thinks of as its security needs in the Black Sea region. And it only saw Crimea as this point as a possible base to do this. I think there is another wrinkle to this, which is when the crisis happened, I remember very well that when you pointed out to some critics of Russia that Russia is probably, rightly or wrongly, afraid of NATO expanding into Ukraine itself and perhaps actually acquiring Crimea as a base. That you could provoke allergic reactions with that observation or with that suspicion. And very often you would be told, well, NATO isn't even on the table, right? There is this vague promise for eventual NATO membership for Ukraine that was given at the Bucharest summit in 2008, but it's really not a specific thing. And so what are the Russians so anxious about? You know, the problem with that is that they're really, if you try to see it from Moscow's point of view for a moment, they could not possibly be certain at all that that picture wouldn't change quickly. And in fact, it has changed. Ukraine is, and it has every right to be very interested, at least the current Ukrainian leadership. The population situation is a bit different, but Ukraine officially, politically, is very interested in NATO membership. From the point of Moscow, that was a security problem. And I think one of the things that we, as it were, the West, have to learn again is to see ourselves from outside and not to approach a power like Russia by saying, but we know that we are harmless. First of all, we might not be quite right about this. And so just please believe us. Foreign policy, unfortunately, and we practice this ourselves as well, is a matter of due diligence. To maintain security, a state must often make worst-case assumptions. That's actually the responsibility of politicians in this area. And therefore, it was simply not good enough of the West to say that, please believe us, that NATO is somehow not something that's going to happen. So I think, in answer to your question, there are really at least two aspects here. One is Russia wanted to keep Crimea for itself, for security and military reasons. And the other is it wanted to deny specifically Crimea as well to NATO.
Further to that question, if I can interject, no one knows what Volodymyr Zelensky thinks about all this, but it's interesting to theorize that conceivably he might promote more interest in NATO or EU membership, and of course that would be very provocative vis-a-vis Putin. But anyway, we don't know what's going to happen there, but presuming he prevails over Poroshenko, you know, it could happen.
Yeah, he's Zelensky, as you rightly point out, is mostly an unknown force, and partly on purpose, because he has cashed in on the fact that nobody really knows what he stands for politically, by being very cagey and releasing very little of his positions to the public, so the public is free to imagine what they like, and it's very hard to get him on anything, right? We will soon have, I think, it looks as if we are going to have a debate between Zelensky and Poroshenko finally on, I think, the 19th. The date is actually being contested. The election is going to be on the 21st of this month. So in this debate, I would hope we get to hear more specific, things from Zelensky and how he sees the world. I would add one thing. Zelensky, it's interesting to see that Zelensky has come out with a very few things, precisely because he's usually so evasive. He has said he would talk with Putin himself to resolve the conflict. In a Ukrainian context right now, that is actually a slightly risky move. He has also said that he would not give up territory, right? He has very clearly said, I want to talk to Putin, but I will draw the line at giving him anything territorially, neither Crimea nor anything in eastern Ukraine. There's another thing about Zelensky, which is very interesting. His electorate has, in the first round of the election that has already taken place at least, his electorate has turned out to be fairly even spread across the country. There are, of course, certain differences. But he does seem to have, he's particularly strong in the south and in the east. And that's curious because it means he seems to draw on an electorate that tends to be, I don't want to use a polemical term, that tends to be less nationally oriented than Poroshenko's electorate. That's perhaps how I can put it. So there may be that what could happen, and this is incredibly speculative, but to speculate, what could happen is that Zelensky might actually go farther if he gets elected than Poroshenko in taking certain risks to find a negotiated way out of this crisis. He may. I don't know.
Okay, I guess we have time for one more question.
Thank you for your
Okay, all right, two
detailed,
questions. Yeah.
informative talk. The Trump administration has given arms to the Ukraine, which is different from the previous administration. Is there any talk of any further aid, or is that as far as it will go?
Yes, so your question is, if I'm correct, about arms deliveries to Ukraine, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And I can't give you a detailed answer, unfortunately. I can tell you that there have been demands for more arms. I've seen some recently. They turn up, like in the policy debate, at least what's publicly available. You will find people who argue that providing arms to Ukraine should go further. As you know, what has been provided up until now is a number of things, but the tip of the spear really is the Javelin system, and the logic of these arms deliveries is officially to increase the risk for Russia of becoming more aggressive again. The idea is, Stroke Torvald has talked about this, for instance. The idea is to, in essence, deter Russia at this sort of micro level by upping the risks and the costs in case it becomes more aggressive again. And for instance, launches like a tank invasion of other parts of Ukraine. What I find challenging about that idea is that there is no plan B. If Russia were really going to do something like that, and I personally think that at this point it's not likely, but if Russia were going to do something like that, and if it was then met by Ukrainian defensive forces that are equipped with, better arms provided by the West, and suffers heavier losses than it otherwise would have, I don't see that Russia would therefore just walk away. Unfortunately, I think in that sort of terrible scenario, it's more likely that Russia would actually dig deeper, precisely to show the West that it's not that easy. And that would confront the West, and especially NATO, with making the next decision, which would be, are we going to escalate further on our side? And in this horror scenario that I hope we will never see, I think one of the problems that you might see is that this could actually start becoming very difficult for NATO cohesion. Because you have to understand that in NATO, you have countries like the USA who are very powerful and very useful, as it were, in NATO, but who are also far away from the Ukrainian conflict zone. And you have countries such as Germany or France or Poland in its own way, although it's a very complicated case, or the Baltics, which are much closer to the conflict zone. So in a development where, God forbid, this conflict would flare up again and leave its current sort of stagnant, if terrible, state and become much, much worse again, I don't think that simple escalation against Russia is such an easy proposition as the people who have argued for lethal aid think. In that sense, I can't help it. I understand very much that the Ukrainian army, of course, wants these weapons. I would. But my sense is that this is a somewhat risky policy, actually.
Okay, how about the last question? The question is, if oil prices were to decline as low as $30 or $40 a barrel,
Yeah.
how would that affect Russia's posture vis-à-vis Ukraine? I think that's the question, is it? Essentially.
There's one thing that I think is very important to note, which is that a very severe oil price decline has already occurred. And we're already after this, and the oil price has to an extent recovered. I can't tell you what the low point was in 2014-15, but
It was
I think
26.
exactly. I think it was 20. I was going to say 24, but there you are. So in a way, it's been tested, right? You could, of course, wonder if something like that happening again could have a larger effect on Russia. But Russia has, on the whole, been able to draw on its sovereign wealth fund, which was considerable. It has decreased it. You can see this very clearly in the statistics. It has clearly taken a hit. Russia has also seen clear social reverberations, and those have something to do with the fact that Putin's approval ratings are actually going down, right? So Russia has suffered from this. It has suffered from the fallout, from the economic fallout of this thing. But, and this is, I think, something we might have to learn about sanctions. Sanctions are, as you know, extremely complicated subject on legally, ethically, in terms of efficiency. Sanctions are really incredibly hard to think about. And they're also very polarizing. But the Russian case, if we restrict it to that, the Russian case is special for one very simple reason, I think, simple but true, which is the United States has not tried before to sanction such a large economy. And while Russia has suffered, its ability to resist and show resilience has also clearly been greater than the greatest proponents of sanctions would have expected. I don't say this polemically, but I do recall some experts arguing in 2014 and 15, if we only put on enough sanctions, the whole thing will just collapse. And essentially, we can bring down the Putin regime, either from the street or internally from the elite itself, right? The people around him will at some point have enough and say, well, this isn't working out. And we don't really understand why you made that impulsive decision with 4 other people in the room, it seems, to take Crimea and get us into this mess. And then you couldn't walk away, but you went into eastern Ukraine on top of all of this. And we know how, that in many ways this didn't work out well for Russia at all. So there were people who thought that if we isolate Russia enough, if we bring together a coalition of sanctioners, and that has been quite successful, more successful, for instance, than I thought at the time. I didn't think that the sanctions regime would last that long and would last that long well coordinated between the Europeans and the US, and I've been proven wrong. But I think that the most ardent proponents of sanctions also have been proven wrong, in that sanctions are simply not having the impact that would be needed to change Russian behavior. Who knows the future? But for now, in the few years we have had, sanctions have not been a panacea. I think that's clear.
Well, Tarik, thank you very, very much. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.